the scopage on your design fee for Sunbridge.
Okay. There's 3 of us here.
John's on his way. He just couldn't. He was here in just a minute.
We can go ahead and call these over.
Yes, sir.
I'm ready. Go ahead and call the school board workshop on budget and procurement to order for Tuesday, February 2nd. Welcome everyone. If you would please silence your cell phone before we get going here. And first item on the agenda are the procurement procedures. Cheryl and Ed, I think, are you going to lead that conversation?
Do budget first.
Switch it. We're up. Okay. We will do the preliminary budget overview and planning discussion. Sarah, turn it over to you. We just started. We haven't done anything. Sorry. No, you said you were coming. Get moving.
Okay. Good afternoon, school board members and staff and community. This afternoon, we wanted to give an update on the status of the budget, and we'll start with a little bit of history on our FTE, student growth, and then talk about this year's budget, where we were, where we are now, and then look at what we're looking at going forward. We also want to make sure we take this opportunity to give you all an update on what's going on with the current CARES Act grant as well as the upcoming.
Sarah, just, we've got a couple screens. We have one screen. That's
Blue
working.
screen. I don't see
I have,
that.
I have the only screen that if Ruben can.
We can go sit in your laptop.
I can turn mine off and make it turn blue too.
Do you all have your handout?
No.
He needs to do a reset.
Ruben's gonna be doing a reset.
Okay, can y'all see any of the side screens well enough for her to keep going?
Okay, I'll try. I can close the front.
There you go. John, you can share mine with you.
Sarah, do you want the PowerPoints and everything passed out?
Yeah, if you have the hard copies, go ahead and pass them.
Oh, okay, we have our.
She's doing it opposite of the agenda.
Never mind, I wasn't even using my screen either. I already fixed mine.
Let's just do it this way. It's just easier. Thank you. Thank you, sister.
That looks better. All right, everybody.
Now I can see. Yes, sir.
There,
Okay.
back to you.
All right. Okay, so starting on slide 3 with our FTE growth, you guys have seen this chart over and over, but this is the history of the growth in our district. You can see down at the bottom the percentage by year. So historically, we've run right around 3% annually in our student growth numbers. This does incorporate both our traditional schools as well as our charter schools, the K scholarships, and the family empowerment scholarships. So, let him reboot that. But on the next slide,
Before you turn for that, does anybody know if all school districts have had a little bit of a dip based on the COVID and people disappearing, or is it the nature of our population?
Significantly. They're saying about 70,000 students across the state have currently been unaccounted for, which is like it's like the size of our school district. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about that this week in the legislature. It's worse in South Florida than it is, for example, in North Florida.
Thank you, sorry.
okay, no, you're good. Important question, and we'll get into the funding implications of that a little bit later. Okay, so the next slide, slide 4, breaks this down by the categories, with our traditional schools being the orange bar at the bottom, then charters in the blue, the K, and family empowerment that just started last year. But the important thing to note here is that our traditional school growth really hasn't been growing the last couple of years, and you'll see the dip in 2021 that we're looking at this year. So when we continue to talk about growth in Osceola County and growth in our overall FTE, it's important to keep in mind that the larger percentage that we see going to charters and voucher programs. This next slide shows you the FTE by program. So in the program codes are over on the left. A few things to note on this slide. If you look down in the bottom half, program 130, ESOL or English language learners, you'll see that we were kind of growing proportionately there in the first couple of years shown on the slide, and then we've seen a decrease in that program the last 2 years. So we are looking into that. Some of that may have been the increase from the students that came from Puerto Rico a few years ago, and then some of them leaving the system or exiting the program. But we also want to make sure that we really understand what's behind these numbers. So next one to look at are more severe ESE programs, 254 and 255. You'll also see kind of a buildup and a dip there in the 254s. So another area that we're looking into further. And then the last one is program 300, our career and tech program. Definitely another one, we know we were growing our tech programs, but you'll see that dip this year. And some of that is expected, as we knew our digital kids weren't able to participate in some of the programs. So some of that is definitely COVID related, but obviously it's an area that we want to continue to grow.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but these numbers go back to the industry certification results for 300, or is it just enrollment in the class?
I believe, I'm looking at Jose, I believe this is just enrollment at this point.
Enrollment in those courses.
Right. But unfortunately, as Sarah mentioned, in the spring, some of our digital classes, we were unable to offer the full range of services because they were digital and there just weren't options. So that, we believe that is an out of that.
On the 254 and 255, does that include UCP, or is UCP not considered a traditional school? Or is that considered?
UCP is a charter school, and several of their children are classified as 255, but the numbers on this slide incorporate all charters as well, so they would be included in these numbers. Good point. And also, just to clarify, the last column, the 2021 survey too, those are the actual student counts that were here in October. They're not projected, not what we're currently funded off of, but students that are actually here in our school system as of October of this year.
The amount of growth that's occurring, we've got some really expansive developments that are coming out of the ground pretty quickly. I would expect that numbers to. I'm just kind of surprised that the number is static like that and it's not increasing commensurate with.
We would normally expect it to be, like I said, we typically grow roughly about 3% a year on average. So this is definitely COVID related. And
We've got a lot of kids just missing.
It's statewide and actually a national issue.
As I reported to you last week, our student services team has launched since January a very active program to try to identify those kids who just did not enter but who were on our rolls. That does not explain the students who never enrolled with us, who are either still, they may have moved here from New York, but they're completing their virtual schooling from New York as opposed to making that transfer at that period. I talked to one parent who that was the situation yesterday. Those students are outside of this number, but we had about 260 students that student services had identified. As of just today, I spoke to Ms. Lane again, they found 16 to get back into the system. 13 originally last week and then 3 again this week. So we are starting to kind of find out where those kids are. We've also been able to identify that some of them moved to other locations and are still in the process of requesting records. But it's a definite issue. Like I said, it was a part of the House committee, I believe, this week. Representative Fine from Brevard had some statements in the press yesterday about the concern about where are these 70,000 children across the state who are not accounted for in our schooling systems.
You know, I'm being optimistic. I'm hopeful this will sunset one day, and maybe, you know, once we get this behind us, we may get a big rush in 23, 24 of, you know, we have to account for. So we just have to.
We're hoping we'll see a large percentage of them return to the system next year. It's a many parts.
A lot of kindergartners that are being held back will also be dumped in too, maybe.
And that's one of the concerns that we have, would we see a significant increase in kindergarten in August because of students who were held out a year because the required age is not until 6. So actually Dr. Respis and the team are gonna launch kindergarten registration about 3 weeks earlier than we'd originally planned. So we're looking at, I believe, the first week of March is what we decided, right, Jane? To really do a big push. I mean, we've had an ongoing effort to try to get kids into our VPK digital program, kindergarten, but we really wanna launch big time in March so that we can plan ahead for what additional allocations or space may be necessary to serve the children that we wanna get back in the system.
Are there any schools that are under capacity right now? Because if they all come back, where are they gonna go?
Yes.
So we do have some that absorb that, and so rather than like redistrict or rezone some of the places there to help.
We've had students under enrollment all year.
One of the other things that we're keeping an eye on is how many students have actually come back since the October count. So did we have students return for second semester? And we pulled that data about a week ago. We were around 300 students up district-wide. So we'll have another week or two before the official February survey, and then we'll have a better idea of how many additional students we've recaptured in second semester. Okay, so slide 6 is taking the change in our FTE student numbers by category. And you'll see, first column is last year. So at the end of last year, we had 69,378 full-time equivalent students in Osceola. And then our projection for this year was 71,315. We actually ended up first semester at the 68.9. But because of the emergency order and the hold harmless provision for funding, we are continuing to be funded at the 71,315. So it was actually a drop of 3.3% in our students from projection. So if you move on to the next slide, typically we would have seen that funding reduction in January when they would have come out with a FESP third calculation. And the value of that funding reduction would have been the $18.1 million. And what we would be talking about right now is how do we cut $18.1 million out of our budget. We're not having to have that particular conversation because of the hold harmless funding provision. However, it is really important to keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this, that those students who were not here this year, the lost students that we're hoping to see returned, just because we were held harmless on our funding for this year, if those students don't return to the system next year, our budget will take a hit.
Are we doing anything to make our appreciation known to the governor and Corcoran on how much we appreciate this piece?
I wrote a note to both of them on behalf of the board and myself and our community after their visit to Buggy Creek Elementary School when they made the second emergency order announcement. But certainly if you would like for us to draft a letter from the board, we'd be happy to do that, let you guys review it, and then you could all sign it and we could send it.
What would y'all?
I agree, because we tend to bash them when it's negative, beat them up. I think positive.
I think it would be a good idea.
I think
don't
I
think
saw
we
head
can-
nods all
I
around,
think
so
thanking them once a month or so right now would not hurt anything.
I will be sure to we'll get a letter
With
drafted and to
Yes.
you guys to review. Maybe chocolates for Valentine's.
Yep, there you go. I mean, it obviously makes a huge deal to us. It's gotta be making a huge deal to other districts in the state on, it's bad enough to have to deal with some of the things we're having to deal with all the things we're having to do at school. If we had to focus on this too, it would be one giant goose egg in the middle of everything. So
Absolutely.
it's not just the money, it's allowing us to focus on what we need to be focusing on, and maybe
And
that's
and
part
allow
of it.
us to keep our staff stable, and to protect the jobs that the board had set out to do since last March, and I think the governor and the commissioner have been on board with that as well.
It is very significant, and our district is not even the highest. So I mean,
Right.
there are several other districts throughout the state that would have a much more significant loss as well. So statewide, it's huge. Okay, so next slide, slide 8. I talked a little bit about the hold harmless implications already, but especially for our newer board members, just want you to know that normally this is when we would be receiving the third FESP calculation. It has not been released, and there's discussion at the state level about whether they're even going to release it. We haven't heard a final answer yet. The districts and the finance officers have continued to stress that we really would like at least for it to be released, even though there will be no change to our funding. There's a lot of other data in there that's very helpful. So we'll see if we get that or not. But if not, they will be submitting memos to us for some of the other data that we do need at this time during the year. So, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have the second semester count, survey 3 in mid-February, and then the next change to our state funding would typically come in April with the fourth FESP calculation. And the way that the emergency order was written, all districts that continue to remain below their student projection will continue to be funded the same way. Any districts that end up being above projection will get the benefit of that additional growth. And there would be a small proration that they think there's enough money within the state budget to handle, so it wouldn't potentially impact all the rest of the districts. But we will know that once we get the final February count numbers. Okay, so next slide, slide 9. The exercise that we typically go through, like I said, normally we would be looking at the $18.1 million cut and talking through what we're going to cut out of the budget, but we still want to kind of go through the same exercise. So you'll see that there's no budget impact there. However, there was an increase in our charter school FTE, as well as an increase or a decrease in our family empowerment growth. We do hold budget holdbacks for both of those, so that when we see an increase there, we don't have to take the total hit for it. We actually plan for it and set some of the budget aside for those purposes. So the net impact of all of those changes was $1.6 million to the good. So, and then that carries over to the following slide. That is a starting point. The other thing we do from projections at the beginning of the year to day 20, once the year starts and we know what students have showed up, is we go through the analysis of looking at our teacher allocation units. And since I mentioned we were under projection, that means we don't need quite as many teachers as we had originally planned for. Or positions, no individual people are cut or laid off, but actual positions. So usually we will try and handle that through vacancies. But the value equated to $5.2 million that we were able to carve out of the budget back in September after the day 20 counts. We also adjust our the school's discretionary budgets at that time. So they took a little bit of a hit there as well, because those are tied to the number of students in each school. We were able to pull that money back. And then as far as where we chose to allocate that money, about $2.6 million is being spent on the simultaneous instruction. So the extra period supplement that we had approved for teachers and that were teaching both face-to-face and digital students within the same class period that are receiving that supplement. There was also some extra pay for 7th period. This value is that's above and beyond. We always have teachers that teach the 7th period class and get the extra period pay for that, but there was substantially more than that this year due to our staffing. So you'll see that number here. And then the last line, the temporary allocations for CARES leave. So the 10 days that everyone was allowed for CARES-related leave, this is not actually the value of those days. People are continuing to get paid at their regular salary for those days, just like extra leave days. But in situations where we had to add additional staff or temporary substitutes to cover those classes, the cost of that is reflected here. So the net of all of those changes from the beginning budget was a increase or a benefit of $3.2 million.
Now, the three expenditure items, the extra pay, the 7 periods of the CARES, was that taken from general revenue or was that taken from the CARES grant itself?
So at this time, it was taken out of the general fund. Simultaneous was not approved to be spent out of the CARES grant, and the others we did not put in our CARES grant application. Now we'll talk about that because there's some things we may be able to go back and charge to CARES 2. So there's still some opportunity here to go backwards. But at this point, right now, we had to go ahead and fund everything out of the general fund. So the 3.2 surplus that you see here, which is what we had previously talked to the board about, and this is essentially what's going towards the one-time non-recurring supplements that are currently in negotiations with our different employee groups. Any questions on that? All right. I'll just briefly touch on our long-range forecast. At this point, there are so many questions up in the air about the budget for what's going to happen with student enrollment. We're still questioning even statewide how to nail down the FTE forecast for next year. And obviously, the legislative session hasn't started. Governor's budget just came out on Friday. So we haven't even really tried to put together a long range going forward at this point. This will just give you a snapshot of where we've been. Governor's budget did come out late last week, and a couple things I just wanted to go ahead and mention. So the base student allocation, we have going up by $132 a student, or 3.06%. And that is where we would have to pay any FRS, Florida Retirement System, rate increases out of that, as well as that's where the only place we're able to pay any additional salary increases. And all the other increases to our budget have to come out of that base. So, yes, that currently increasing by 3%. The other significant increases to mention are the mental health allocation is being allocated an additional $10 million, and the teacher salary increase allocation is in there again. It was $500 million last year, and it's growing by another $50 million in the governor's budget for total increase per student funding of about just under 3%. So we'll see that. That's just the initial policy document, and now we wait and see what the House and the Senate budgets come out with and where they land. And it's an important policy document to keep in mind to kind of know where this is guiding the process. I also want to mention the funding compression allocation, which has been so critical to our district as one of the lower funded. That is maintained within this budget. And we are starting to see a bigger benefit out of that for next year as well, based on the way it's calculated. So it's one of this board's legislative priorities. All of our lobbyists are well aware of it. But I just want to keep that on the radar that is still critically important for our district to make sure that's maintained. Okay. Moving on, I know some of you wanted to dig into a little bit more detail on the CARES grant. That's why Leslie's put together some good handouts for us, and I'm going to ask her to kind of help us talk through some of this. But I'll share with you just the overview that's on the slides. So slide 13, currently for the first round, our district received just over $20 million. And the big grant is the ESSER grant that's on the top line, but you'll see that there are several other kind of sub-grants within what's considered the CARES Act. So this is all of the money that we received out of the first round that we're currently in the process of working through. And the next slide is just a quick snapshot of some of the more significant items. We use some of these dollars to fund one-to-one for both our kindergartners and our third graders. So that was included in this grant. A bunch of the instructional materials and software, obviously PPE and cleaning supplies specific to COVID. We were able to move some of our computer tech salaries to fund them out of this grant. And then the COVID testing that the board has commissioned is being charged here as well. And if you want to flip to your handout, the first page of the handout, I know there was a question, I believe Mr. Melendez really wanted to find out kind of what was initially requested and asked for that was denied. So there's a section down at the bottom, and I'll let Leslie speak a little further to this if we need to, but particularly the simultaneous was one that it never was even approved in the original budget. I believe it was just conversation back and forth. And then you'll see some of the other items down there that were considered for this but didn't end up being approved in the grant.
Looks like that.
So next is handout.
The first page of the handout.
What's up?
The very bottom right.
Yeah, and then you can also see the amendment columns. Any questions on that one?
NWEA, another abbreviation for us. On the handout, under instruction materials, NWEA.
Dr. Pace, do you want to explain NWEA?
Sure, I have my button flashing.
I'm not questioning, I just don't know what the abbreviation is.
NWEA is the formative assessment product that we're using. It's a nationally based, nationally normed assessment, but it also is highly aligned to the Florida assessment, and it's in reading, math, and science. I also just wanted to remind the board that one of the original recommendations for some of these CARES Act dollars was to try to look at things that you were currently paying for in the general fund that you could push into CARES in order to help continue to work on that fund balance in the event that our funding for next year is cut considerably. These were in the preliminary, conversations about the state budget, and it was looking like with sales tax continuing to decline, that could be a significant issue for us. So hence that was the computer tech salaries that you see. We were able to move into the CARES Act, but it also was what we were trying to do, for example, with the 8 Valencia College teachers. We currently have 8 of their math teachers who teach a class in each of our high schools, our comprehensive high schools for Math for College Readiness, that we pay for part of their salary, but not all. We had hoped to push that into the CARES Act. We were unable to do that. The same thing with AVID, the same thing with our our gifted screening. So, we still have been able to make good use of these dollars, but there were some things that they did not want us to shift. So.
What about Canvas? Can you try to slide Canvas in there?
Canvas is in there, she says. Right. Yes, it is. If you look right above School City on the top of the list under Purpose Prep, Canvas is in there. We did try to put some of the district-wide software programs that are being used for instructional purposes into the CARES Act.
Good job.
Okay, so moving on, we wanted to talk about the next round of the CARES dollars, which have already been out there, but just a status update. We have not yet received our official allocation amount from Florida DOE. They are still up there working on that. So once we get our official allocation, then we'll also be going through the grant application process. So while these dollars, we know how much we're getting, we still have to actually go through the application process, put a budget together, have the specific budget approved, and we are not exactly sure on what that timeline is going to be at this point. So we're still anxiously awaiting for that information. But we have gone ahead and put together a preliminary plan that we wanted to get the board's feedback on. And so part of this does continue some of the things that are currently being charged to the first CARES grant. So that's a large piece of it. But Leslie, do you want me to let you talk this one through?
Sure.
she's done all the heavy lifting on this, so.
Okay. We've seen 3 or 4 projections somewhere between 57.5 million to almost 60 million. We're going with the 59,800 as our, kind of draft projection of what we think we're going to get. Right off the top, 22% of it goes to charter schools. So what the district would have is 46.6 million. I think the charter schools get 13.1 right off the top, goes to them. The next section is all those items that you saw under CARES, all the different software, educational software and all, where we moved it out of SAI into CARES 1, and Dr. Pace would like to continue having that cost savings on our side of the house and put it into CARES. It'll be about $10 million over the course of the 3 years. So that's the first section that's like 7.5 million that's coming up. That's just a continuation of things we put in CARES 1 that we want to continue for the next 2 years in CARES 2. Looking at potentially going 1-to-1 computers for the rest of the district, all students 1-to-1. That would include some personnel to help roll it out, some PD. That's a $17 million price tag on that. Then after that,
And certainly, board, again, this is a draft. We want your feedback on this. But our rationale for bringing this forward at this time is, number one, we won't have a chunk of money like this that gives us the flexibility to do what we want to do for kids. Number two, so many of our neighboring districts and districts across the state and across the nation have taken advantage of this opportunity to go 1-to-1. I fear that we're going to be falling backwards in terms of a competitive disadvantage if we don't start putting devices in all the hands of our students. With the understanding that that would be a long-term commitment in terms of computer refresh. And once the CARES Act expires in 2 years, then we would also be looking at any personnel that we add to support it. Because the effectiveness of a 1-to-1 implementation requires training for teachers and more tech support in the schools to manage the equipment and keep it operational on a regular basis. Mr. Thorne is working on a comprehensive plan for that. It's, still getting the final I's dotted and T's crossed before we bring it forward, but we would just want some input from you about that. We currently are going to be 1-to-1 kindergarten, 3rd grade, and 6th grade. But Mr. Bass, it was one of your community conversation meetings where we had a parent from Orange County saying, she was moving from Orange County to Osceola. She was used to her child being provided a device, and we don't do that systemically. I think this is a chance where, for us to remain competitive, it would be something that I would recommend, but it's really up to the board. It's a significant investment.
Robert, you have something to say?
No. I'm just taking it
And
in.
as you mentioned, you said, you get a chance to respond.
No, but she was right. There was, during that engagement, one of the parents did acknowledge that Orange County does it this way, and she was kind of surprised that all of her students doesn't have. We were not at 1-to-1.
I had the 4th day of the community meetings, and in the piece where they designed their school, whatever you call it, their ideal school, they said it was almost unanimous. Of all the groups up to that point, which was 80% of it, was 1-to-1 from the community. So that's kind of it.
Yeah, and what I heard was 1-to-1, and the little variation is maybe at elementary schools, the device stays there instead of taking home, because they might not have the same ability to treat it properly or things like that and break it when they take it home. So at least while they're on campus, they can do things about there. I don't know if that's something.
One of the things that we have learned is that before we hand the device to the child, those OtterBox cases are critically important for our youngest learners, absolutely. And certainly, there are things that we'd have to consider and would be a part of our long-term planning process. But this is just kind of getting initial reaction from the board and potential direction as we move forward, and then obviously it'll all come back to you before it's finalized.
It's kind of finalize that, because I think it is pretty important as a strategic vision, is that when COVID is over, to what degree do we keep that digital competency on the students? I wouldn't mind if they all have programs to submit their homework online, learn how to do attachments, because as a new generation of kids come in, I don't want them to be at a disadvantage, because new ones know how to open up a file, how to name it and things like that. So
using that digital technology moving forward and how to incorporate it in the curriculum. So it's not just having the device, but then using it as a teaching device as well. So that's one thing I'd like to see strategically implemented at the same time.
That's why the professional development for teachers is such a critical part of that. Not only do we hand out the devices, but then how do we teach our students to use them most effectively long-term for what skills they'll need in a 21st century workspace.
I think you got the head nod. 1 to 1 is the. At least we'll get there. We'll have like a rolling.
No, it's just consensus.
Oh, the only thing about it, and I spoke with Peter about it before offline, is that you do it in trenches. You don't, do everyone at the same time, then every computer got refreshed. You know what I mean? You kind of break it down, and so that way when you do it and you're refreshing every year, you're not refreshing every single one of them. You're doing it in manageable chunks. So
And we currently have a refresh cycle in our budget, not to the extent that it would have to be with this, but there is money set aside that for the next 4 years, we would propose banking so that when we do have to refresh more, we'd have that already reserved built up.
Right. And plus, we still have E-rate and everything else, because even though the COVID grants go away, we got E-rate funding and matching, and so we can still use some of those regular dollars for.
E-rate is not for devices,
We can't
correct?
use E-rate on devices.
Right,
We use
E-rate
it
is
on
for
network
infrastructure.
And servers and things like that, we can't use it on devices. So that's why we have money built in year to year. I think it's like $3 million per year right now.
That's what we currently have in
to
the
do the
capital plan, that
refresh.
we would look at allocating additional capital dollars.
So as part of the plan that I'm working on, I'm laying out years 3, 4, 5, and 6 as far as refresh is concerned, because we believe that we can competently keep a machine in service for 7 years successfully before it has to be replaced. The trick is making sure we have the warranty to cover it up to that point in case something happens. So we're looking at the warranty piece, we're looking at cases like Dr. Fce said, of course, and the devices themselves. So right now we use Dell devices, and that's what we're looking at going forward. Grades K and 1 would still be iPads, but grades 2 forward would be laptops.
It may sound like a pipe dream, but there's endowments out there too, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, again, it's like I don't want to base futures on some grant that may or may not exist, but do we have like the grant department looking at foundations that do support those kind of programs?
Answer yes.
Do we have enough of the hotspots? Because we still have a lot of students who don't have access to internet. It's unbelievable what we do, and especially in the rural areas. So,
Mr. Thorne,
Yes.
you want to tell her, we do have a significant number, and T-Mobile has a program where
That
we can
is-
get access to more, but we've not pushed that button yet.
That is
because you have
correct. So we currently have right now, every student at Discovery, for example, there's about 1,050 have hotspots if they need them. We have hotspots available for checking out at Liberty and Point Siena. We also took an additional 4,000 hotspots from T-Mobile for the beginning of spring last year for any student who needed some sort of connection. So about 30% of our students who borrowed a device needed that type of internet connection because they didn't have anything at home. So they used the T-Mobile network. We also have a program with Spectrum that we're standing up for families who have lost their for whatever reason, they've lost their connection to Spectrum. And we developed a plan to get them back onto that network outside of Spectrum. So as far as a grant is concerned. So we can get them connection again to use that network. So we have hotspots throughout the county as far as students who need to make some sort of connection. If they're in a rural location, they have to go somewhere to get that connection, but they can. So they can do that through AT&T, through Spectrum, through T-Mobile. And again, we also have the hotspots they can use. So we've passed out approximately 5,500 hotspots, and we have 500 in reserve right now. If we go fully one-to-one, the plan is to have another 30% of that number of hotspots available. So we're working with that company to make sure that becomes available. So they have a project 10 million where we can get a hotspot for free and data up to 100 megabytes per year. But that's not enough for our students, so we'd have to we'd have to implement some sort of data plan for that. They have a $15 unlimited per month data plan that we can implement, which is vastly reduced compared to some other providers. So we're looking at that right now.
On our hotspots, I've never personally have to use one, so excuse my ignorance. Do we have enough coverage countywide? Because there was an incident where there was a father who lives on Nova Road, had a hotspot, didn't work, so he would put the kids in the van and drive to the school and sit in the parking lot and tap into the Wi-Fi, which is not, I don't like to see that, obviously.
So there are areas in the county that still have no coverage. Even though T-Mobile and Sprint have combined, there's still not enough coverage out there. So those folks unfortunately do end up having to go somewhere, unless they have Spectrum or something where they have a home network that they connect to. And any of our devices can connect to any type of network at home, whether it's AT&T or Comcast or what have you, they can still connect. But there are still places in our rural areas that have no connection whatsoever.
They gotta
Even
have
with
cell
T-Mobile.
service. They gotta have cell service.
That is correct. For those hotspots to work, you have to have cell service.
There are
That is
places
correct.
On Nova Road, you do not have
where
cell
you do
service
not
now.
And they have good cell service too.
It's
sometimes
getting
you
better.
gotta-
That's an unfortunate reality that we live with.
Southside Points again, that's terrible.
Have we done a study that allows us to look at what we're paying for this appropriate service in hotspots versus piggybacking on what Spectrum is doing, putting hotspots at all their residential locations? And we can, basically, if you have a Spectrum account, for example, then you can hop onto a Spectrum hotspot anywhere, right? Have we investigated the opportunity to piggyback with them and use some kind of that where it's more maybe a stronger infrastructure or more stable infrastructure?
So we know where they're located, and we've published like a heat map of where they're at, but we've not done that type of comprehensive study. Because right now, what we've done as a district is, like with the hotspots, we went ahead and purchased those with the data plans. So we pay for that anyway, and then we give that to the student. Now, back to Mr. Bass's point, there are areas where you got to drive somewhere, unfortunately, whether that's to the school parking lot or, to a McDonald's, to a Starbucks, something like that, to get on a network. So yes, that can happen, but we've not done that type of comprehensive study to see how T-Mobile overlaps with Spectrum. We
This
certainly
may be a great opportunity for a public-private partnership where, because I know Spectrum will put a router on the outside of your house and extend their cover, their Wi-Fi, right? So it may be something that's already been created that at least these kids, who maybe they have to get in their car and drive to a school have more access to than bad cellular service,
So we
which
do
I
have
think
those
that in
maps.
your area, in my area, are
Yeah.
actually pretty bad.
So we do have those maps from Spectrum about where those places are, so we can direct folks there. But the good news with T-Mobile is we have started that partnership with them, and other counties have too, to be frank about it, to expand that access. As well as, like I said earlier, we have entered into an agreement with, or we are entering into agreement with Spectrum for those parents who, for whatever reason, lost their service, during the pandemic, for example, to get them service in another way.
But that partnership doesn't involve erecting cellular
No,
towers,
it
for
does not.
example, right? So
Absolutely
we're
not.
increasing the structure, it's just us using their service, we're just a client, right?
That is correct.
Whereas something in partnership with someone like, not saying with Spectrum, but with Spectrum, is that they're doing this regardless, and it's much easier for them to get permission from a homeowner to say, can we put this hotspot on the outside of your home so that the kids in this neighborhood who don't have access otherwise can hop on to do their schoolwork?
We certainly can look into that for sure. Thank you for bringing that up.
Pete,
Yes, sir.
if you get with me, the lady to contact at Spectrum, so you cut through all the layers, is Margaret Johnson. She's on the State Board of Ed, so she gets it. And
I
then
know.
give you her direct line and everything.
Mr. Callen and I are working with,
To resolve the other contract.
And the last thing I want to add real quick, on the Nova Road, since the Newman property has a little bit of excess land on it, will we consider maybe erecting a cell phone tower on there? So carving out a piece of it
That's
to
a good
lease
point.
out. Because I know cell phone
Point.
towers generate revenues for the district too, so it's a win-win scenario. Nova's having an issue, and we're gonna commence with that. We can do the cell phone tower before we build the school. around the school different ways, you know.
Interesting with the Sunbridge development, because that that reaches out a little bit further too. Are they gonna have any dedicated areas with, I'm sure they're gonna have to, because there's no coverage out
Well,
there.
I'm looking at the superintendent, so I got an affirmative heading out there on the Noble project, and maybe you'll get cell tower out there. As long as staff's aware of it, we'll deal with that later. There's a lot of details, but the fact is, we got land out there now.
I agree.
I appreciate the consensus and also the helping us problem solve. We'll move from here and then bring back a more comprehensive plan as this moves forwards.
Okay, the next section of CARES 2, obviously the grant is there to help cover expenses that are a result of COVID. So we have in the plan unemployment costs due to COVID leave funds, and also additional PPE for next year. The indirect cost on a lot of these federal grants, we have an indirect cost, 4.11% is the amount this year that we can take off the top of the grant that basically goes back to the district to cover expenses across the district, like for accounts payable, purchasing, things that as we process the grant, it's going to touch different departments and things. So that's just money that goes back into the district pot of money to cover general expenses. Another priority of this grant is stopping the slide and getting kids back to grade level. So we have remediation money in there right now. Yesterday they started February 1st to May 30th. Comprehensive remediation plan, after school, Saturday school, before school. And you see we have 3.5 million in that for teacher OPS, and then other expenses to supplement supplies, food for dinner and snacks, and then transportation. There's also a line for summer acceleration, which is summer school. The other stuff is just at the school before, after. Then we have summer school, and transportation to go with it. We have money for summer teacher PD. And then this next area is we had a TSL grant that covered teacher mentoring, teacher mentors. And that was a 3-year grant, and now we don't have it anymore. But Dr. Pace feels this is a very, very important program that we have, and she wanted to look at possibly continuing it into next year with the teacher mentors at the schools. There's a new teacher center contract on standards. It's an 18-month program that they're looking at rolling out. Again, teacher PD on all the standards and everything. And then a district resource teacher for K-12 acceleration that would focus on our IB, AP, CTE, all of those areas to continue the acceleration in those areas.
Occupational status.
I just wanted, I shared information with the board last week at our strategic plan workshop about our mentoring program as a part of Goal 2. This is specifically to address our 19 highest need schools by providing a half-time release for our highly qualified teachers who teach students and model for teachers in the classroom half a day, and then provide coaching and mentoring support the other half of the day. We have finished now, or are finishing this spring, our contract with New Teacher Center for a train-the-trainer model. So our 2 district leads for this program will be able to continue to utilize those tools. But we just really hate to lose this because it has proven highly effective in retaining those vulnerable first and second year teachers in our high need schools and providing them the skills they need to be successful to really move kids. So this is really all about, this last half of the page is about required interventions as a part of Emergency Order 07 to catch up with that COVID slide, accelerate learning, and help students reach their highest level of potential, and supporting teachers in doing so to help them be more successful would be our recommendation for those things.
Now, where's like the data scientist stuff? Is that under the positions and programs?
That's a separate grant on top of CARES. That was a dedicated funding source from GEARS, the governor's portion of the budget that could go only for that purpose.
I think
That's it for CARES, unless you had any other questions.
Ma'am?
And we would continue with Sarah for the capital projects fund.
Just a couple things in the capital area that I wanted to share at this time. So update on our revenue collections. So the first is our impact fees. The last 2 years, we brought in about $74.5 million. Our forecast for this year was 50. Actually, last year we had set it lower at 50 and then kept seeing the revenue, rolling in. As you guys are well aware, the growth in our community is not slowing down at all. So at this time, we are still seeing our impact fee revenues roll in. We had collected $29.2 million through November, so that's 5 months worth. Don't have December's final numbers yet.
Which is right on track for 74 again? Pretty close?
And Mr. Thacker, as you know, we talk about this with the Business Advisory Board every month. At our last meeting, we kind of talked about, is it time to readjust our revenue projection yet? And, we'll continue to talk about that as we see another month or two of actual collections roll in. But we are also, we've started our next impact fee study. So over the next 6 months or so, we'll be going through that process to look at the comprehensive study again and then reassess our rates going forward from that point. We are hoping that it will come out kind of in the summertime, and then in the fall is when it would go to the county commission for implementation. But there's no specific deadline in terms of a timeline that it has to be completed. Really depends on all the community meetings that we want to have and the community input. I know 3 or 4 years ago during our last study, it kind of stretched out longer, but it's because we kept wanting to make sure we were having all of the necessary community input. So there's not a specific timeline or deadline that you have to comply with.
Oh, because it's like our own timeline. And I think we said some people do it every 3 years, every 4 years, so it's not in statute that it has to be done by.
Correct, and there's no date it has to be done either.
And Sarah, remind me, when are we going to the Growth Management Task Force? Is that next week, I believe?
That's Thursday,
that's our
February
first
11th.
Yes.
And then we are also that day having an introductory meeting with GOBA.
The Greater Orlando Builders Association.
Okay, so that's an update on our impact fee collections. And the next slide is our sales tax collection. And I like to kind of keep looking at this back to March or April, because you can see the trend. So that first line, the April collection number in there that was down 25%, that was actually March's sales tax collections. So if you think about everything had kind of shut down mid-March around spring break time frame. So that was that month. And then obviously the first full month we were down 55% from the prior year. And you can see we've started to make some progress in coming back, but sales tax is not back to where it was. So since COVID, we're down 24% in our sales tax collections.
Can you imagine what that number would be like if we didn't have the housing growth? Because that does help offset a little bit on the sales tax, that would be awful.
Well, October was really good. I guess for Christmas nobody was buying.
So if you look at the actual dollar amounts, you'll see that every third month the amount is higher. So every 3 months we get what they call a quarterly catch-up payment. So it's part of the regular amount collections for that month are offset by that quarterly catch-up
No,
payment.
this is the amount that we get, or, because I know we collect sales tax, but we don't have to remit it to the state when we get it back. Do they hold back a certain amount of money before they give us, or do they just give it?
They don't necessarily hold it back, but there's always discrepancies and corrections.
And this is actually the half penny and the quarter penny, correct?
These numbers reflect the half penny.
This is the half penny, right?
We also get another 50% of this in terms of the hard numbers.
Half, but not the quarter.
This is only the half.
Only the half, not the quarter that will sunset.
In 2025, if no action is taken.
So next slide, the ad valorem property tax collections. I also just wanted to point out there was some concern about whether we would see a delay in people paying their property tax bills this year. I'm happy to report that for Osceola, we did not see that. So in the month of December, in the prior year, we had collected 81.4%, and this year we collected 82.7%. So we are not seeing what we all feared, which would be a significant delay in that cash flowing into the district. Other communities are seeing that. So, like I said, not an impact on our district, which is great to see.
Which means that landlords are paying, even though their tenants might not be paying. So they don't wanna lose their house, even though the tenants are, because there's a significant number of tenants that are behind on paying, taking advantage of the public lease. So we're dodging a big bullet in that one.
So that's all I had for the slides on capital, but I did include for you in the handouts a copy of the capital plan, both the capacity page and the non-capacity page. And there's no real changes at this time that we haven't already discussed, but
Behind the
wanted to make sure that you all had a copy of the most recent version of the capital plan.
So since we're in line, there hasn't been any shifting of priorities then. So I know we talked about transportation west, transportation east. I know west was fully funded. Is transportation east, has it been fully funded yet or accounted for, so to speak?
You're correct. So right now, only one of them has been fully budgeted for. So we would allocate that fund. We would just allocate that funding to whichever came first at this point.
So that's next priority. So if we're able to save some money or get the money that we projected, because I know you said you projected 50, we're getting 75 million. So we're
Well,
getting-
that's impact fees.
Oh, the
That's impact fees. So that would go to build schools.
Also, we can't build the transportation centers. with that.
We may be able to. Historically we were not planning on doing that. That's something we're gonna wanna talk about with our impact fee consultants. To the extent that new ancillary facilities such as transportation and maintenance, to the extent that we can justify that the purpose for them is truly due to growth, we may be able to use a certain percentage of impact fees.
Yeah, because we're not refurbishing a current one, we're building one. I don't wanna make the case.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be kind of clearly documented and justified, but we may be able to change our strategy there a little bit.
Currently, it's listed in the non-capacity or non-impact fee projects.
Sarah, you gonna push through the budget timeline?
And then, yep, lastly, we just have a snapshot of our timeline in here for you. So today, February 2nd, we're having the budget planning workshop. And then the highlighted lines, the next time this will come before the board, we will have another board workshop where we really specifically have our general fund preliminary budget to discuss with you all, as well as capital, on June 1st. And on July 13th will be the tentative budget presentation for the board. And then our two public hearings, July 27th, and the final public hearing to adopt the budget and the millage rate on September 7th.
I would just note that between the close of the legislative session in April, the end of April, and the end of May, Sarah and Jose and I will have individual meetings with each of you to go over where we ended up with the state budget, and again, to make sure that we understand the board's priorities in planning what we will propose for you in June for review.
Any other thoughts, comments, concerns that we should be aware of at this time as we move through the budget process?
You really like what you do, don't you?
It's fun stuff.
It shows, and it's very
Did a
helpful.
great job, Sarah.
Very
Thank you.
helpful to us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sarah, and your whole team. Are we gonna go back to number one now? First time?
Yeah, we just wanted to introduce you.
It doesn't take much. Procurement procedures, if I can get it out. Actually, we've been at this an hour. Would anybody mind if we took a 5-minute recess and come back? Would that be all right?
Yeah, we have time.
Let's just take a quick 5 minutes.
That's a request to speak, right? And then there's a speak. No, let me
When he pushes your thing, it should go on.
Do you have like one for all of it?
can I put this one and not keep Roberts?
Yeah, then you'll both blank.
And see if, how do we know?
It's a different system, and I don't know. You don't have to three now.
And you may want to avoid this. Trying to figure out your mute.
What this does not do is control the microphone. Well, you can be talking away and nobody hear you. We'll give Robert just a second and we will get back at this. Thank you all for allowing us some quick recess. Robert's coming right back. Got everybody very quiet. Are we ready or should we wait for this? Robert's not back yet, but I think he'll be back, so maybe we'll go ahead and get started. We'll reconvene the workshop and we'll turn it over to you two.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hayes, Chairman Thatcher, and board members. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself to the new board members. I'm Ed Parker, Director of Purchasing and Contract Services. Also, I have Cheryl Hood here as our Purchasing Supervisor. And we're going to discuss a few of some procurement methods that we utilize here, and also some changes to some of our documents. So one of the things I want you to know is that we're going to talk about 4 purchasing methods that they use in the state. We're also going to talk about some changes to our evaluation criteria. And then also we're going to talk about our local vendor participation programs in this presentation. And I'll let Cheryl go through those with you. If you have any questions afterwards, we'll be glad to answer them for you.
All right, first of all, our most popular form of purchasing is actually an invitation to bid. Then we got requests for proposals, and I'm gonna go one by one. I'm just letting you know that there's 4 different ones that are more traditional. And then the invitation to negotiate and the request for qualifications that we use for our Ccna process, which is our construction process. So first of all, on an invitation to bid, that of course is our process that we use for that we get the lowest responsible bidder. So as long as they're responsive and responsible, that is who is gets awarded that bid. The next one is our RFP process. RFP is a request for proposals. This is where we, it's usually used for service type work, where service is involved, and it's done through a selection committee process. And with that said, there's scoring criteria involved in that. The next one is invitation to negotiate. That one is actually not used very often, maybe once or twice actually in all my years. And that is done through the, it's for volatile type market where we negotiate and we can negotiate with more than one company at a time and get final negotiations, and then we would take a contract. The next one is the CCNA process. It's for the Consultants Competitive Negotiations Act. And that is a process that's only used for our construction managers at risks, architects, engineers, land surveying, all those types of contracts. And we'll talk a lot more about that in here. The next thing is under the CCNA process, there was a House bill last year that did increase the limit for the individual projects to 4 million and studies over 500,000. However, the district, we still continue to use the 2 million and the 200,000. And what that means is if we're doing a project and it's less than $2 million, we could use our continuing service contracts for less than 2 million. Anything over 2 million would require that we actually put an RFQ out that is specific to that project only and go through the RFQ process, which is a scoring criteria process. So currently it's still at the 2 million and the $200,000.
Now, what's the difference between doing 2 and 4? Like, what's the benefit of the district of keeping it at 2 million versus 4 million?
Well, my opinion would be is that way you've got your smaller projects being done through the continuing service, and then the actual RFQ would be specific for a certain project over 2 million, where the board would have, you know, all the approvals through that process as well. What happens with the continuing service ones is they get put on a rotation basis. And so for that, they would take the next one in line for a project, the next one in line for a project, next one in line. Whereas the other way would be where we'd have to put an RFQ out and it would go through a selection committee.
Now, a wing, what does an average wing cost? To get an idea, because I'm trying to, 2 million means money, but what does it mean in terms of like the type of contract? What kind of construction, like
A
HVAC
wing would
systems,
generally
or
be,
less than 2 million?
a wing would probably go through the CM process where we would do a specific RFQ for it. Like the HVAC projects that go on, that could possibly fall under the 2 million type dollar, though the last time we did it, it ended up being over 2 million, so we had to go out for an RFQ specific for that. So they usually get estimates to see where these projects fall before they let me know whether I have to do an RFQ or whether they're gonna use continuing service. And if they're using continuing service, they just rotate them.
It really is up to the wishes of the board.
Yeah.
This board has always been very fiscally conservative. So for example, when Signature Authority was at $25,000 and then raised to 50, it was a while before the board, previous boards, decided to go ahead and grant that Signature Authority. The same is true for here. We've maintained a very conservative policy that says any project that comes in over 2 million needs to be competitively bid, as opposed to our continuing services contracts, which are competitively bid. They go out and seek bids for all of the sub work, those types of things that come in to make sure that that project is competitive. But it's really a matter of the wishes of the board.
Now, when they become a continuing service contractor, we still kind of vet them a filter to a certain degree to get on there, right?
Oh, correct. There is a competitive process to be a part of our CCNA group, in which they go through the same kind of an RFQ process to be selected. And things like experience, past projects, all of those things come into play in making those kinds of decisions.
And then we just review those like maybe every 3 years or something like that. Because continuing service can't go on forever either.
No, they
By the
cannot.
time they expire, people have to renew them.
They come through the agenda with those.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're 3 years, traditionally 3 years, and they do have the ability to renew 1 year. But that all comes back here. Before we do that. The next slide talks about a sample of RFQ. I did provide a separate handout that was the scoring criteria section of our RFQs. You'll notice on there that I do have some red highlighted changes and some yellow stuff that I wanted to bring to your attention, so we'll talk about that as we go as well. But that is our traditional RFQ. It's got scope and services, it's got the submittal requirements, qualification guidelines, general requirements, special requirements, terms and conditions, and then our draft contract as well. Some of the ideas that we had and we did poll other municipalities. And we thought that it might be in our best interest to maybe see about changing our scoring criteria on our RFQs. We, in red, are the changes that we would like to make in our document. It gives a better, clear description of what the selection committee members would be actually looking for in their documents, so that there's a better, I guess, so that there's a better scoring. They score the 0 through 5, and each of those scoring criteria, if you'll notice on the different pages, like I'm going to say page 2 of the handout, it says like tab 3A, that's worth 2 points, and we're going to talk about that yellow one. But each section, each tab has a weighted value. So the 0 through 5 is multiplied by that weighted value, and that's how the scores are done for the selection committee to determine who are the highest ranked firms when we go through this process.
One of the things that we found as we've gone through the process and that the board brought to our attention is that our 0 to 4 scoring previously really didn't have a defined rubric or criteria. And so in order to make sure that we had stronger scoring criteria, better training for the people who serve on our selection committees, and looking at what other districts, other counties, as she said, municipalities have done, other public entities, they typically had a wider spread for scoring and defined criteria. So that's one of the things that we're recommending here as a potential change to our RFQ process to continue to improve our processes. And then again, we would have to retrain everybody on the committee about what that looks like. In the past, if somebody scored a 2 or a 3, they could just leave it blank with no comment. But if they scored a 1 or a 4, they had to make a comment. But there was some discomfort in making comments, so everybody just kind of landed in that 2 and 3 space. And so it was difficult to determine what really differentiated number 1 from number 2 from number 3 in the end. And we wanted to make sure that it could be more clearly defined, and so the differentiation would be more clear and specific, and people will have to defend their scores based on their review of first the written submittals, and then second the oral presentations.
Because another issue that I had when I was on the board prior, and I spoke to Mark slightly about this, was I remember there were some companies that didn't do what they were supposed to, you know, and I had to be careful that we're not blackballing certain companies, but I wouldn't mind saying, hey, they did not do something, you know, I mean, whatever it is, whether they're under budget or the promise to deliver and it was under par or whatever the case may be, so that way they don't keep hitting us back in. What legally can we do when somebody does not perform a contract fully, so that when they bid again in the future, we know who they are?
It's in the scoring metrics, it's past performance.
I also drafted a proposed debarment policy. We had a very bad situation, I want to tell you about 2 years ago, with a contractor that payments, and we got into litigation, we had to deal with that to get everything fixed. And then, lo and behold, low bid on the next project. Get somebody who comes in with a low bid, end up messing up everything. So you all would decide if somebody was debarred, if what occurred was bad enough, you're out for X period of time. You can't work on a project at the school district.
Can I ask a general question? Looking through the scoring criteria, it doesn't seem like 2 points is that impactful of a preference to a local vendor. It seems like the only way that it would be impactful is if they pretty much scored the same, and then 2 points might make a difference.
It's 2 times 4 though, because there's a weighted value, that it's the 2, and then they can now get up to 5, so it's actually 10. And that's for every committee member. Most committees are 7 members, so that's times 7. So it could make a difference in the scoring of a committee. That program that we have, the 3A and 3B, that's a board-approved program back in 2010. I believe it was 2010. That was a process because we weren't able to give local vendor preference on straight bids, low bids, whatever. That's a state mandated thing. We can't do that. However, in the RFQ process, since it was a scoring criteria. The board approved a program and gave those points. We've never changed them along the way because it's a board-approved program. So that would be up to the board.
So statutorily, you can't say, we will give this to a local vendor. But you can say, under this process, you can be scored higher, right?
On the RFQ.
Do you
yes.
have an idea, what percentage of contracts are awarded to local vendors versus, outside? No.
I don't really, and honestly, there's not a lot of local Osceola County-based contractors. There are not. So that's not usually been the case. We do have some of the local, the land surveyors, architects, we have some of those that are local, and those points really do come in handy. But it's a 3A and 3B program, so even if they're not located, they still can benefit if they show that they have a really good program to bring in their subcontractors as local vendors. And they have to be able to provide that information to us. And that's tracked through facilities where they have to show how many people were, how many of their subcontractors were local vendors. So that is tracked. I don't know that they have an actual number that they could throw out there, but I know that each project, usually I see as at least 35%. Is that probably a good number?
What was that number? I'm sorry.
About 35%. I'm gonna say for the local ones, when you're talking about like
Sign shop, for
irrigation,
example.
signage, site work. We have a lot of good local site work contractors that get a lot of our work locally, glass companies, those kind of things. So they do have really good program for that, and the contractors have really good outreach programs. I know that's further back in my thing, but since we're talking about it, I'll go ahead and say it.
It is.
They do have a very good outreach program. I've seen several of them because now they've switched. Now with the COVID, they haven't had live programs, so they've done a lot of it virtual programs, and they all do have really good programs, and they reach out to the locals. And with that said too, every March, we do a thing at the Heritage Park where all the municipalities in the county, KUA, City of St. Cloud, City of Kissimmee, we do, I'm gonna call it like a reverse trade show.
Yeah.
Where they come and they see us, we give them our information, how to become local vendors and how to win bids. And then we give them lists of our contractors that are on continuing service with our construction so that they can get to be in their bidding process, because we don't select who gets to be in that group, but we can help get them the information that they need so that they can get on their bidding list. So they do have a really good outreach to local vendors.
So I was gonna ask that, but there is a post-award report mechanism where we're finding out how many people have participated, which are local companies, right?
Yes.
And I'm curious, Mark, at some later point to find out kind of what that number looks like. I'm afraid that might be skewed, because if you have one very large contractor like XYZ paving, right, and they have a $25 million contract, then it makes it look like a much higher percentage of our local companies are participating, as opposed to several smaller entities which would do signage, for example.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they do that. I can't answer that one, sorry.
Thank you, though.
Using your company, your line of work as an example, let's say there's a large sign company, they're in North Florida, South Georgia, where, based on this rubric, they can come to Osceola County and rent an office, and then now they're all of a sudden local.
They have to have that for 1 year.
Well, but still, I mean, you follow what I'm saying? It kind of shuns his company, who is truly local, and I just want to make sure that we do keep it truly with the local representation, and not the big guys that may be just coming here and setting up a temporary shop just to get that extra 2 points or these extra. If I'm looking at it correctly.
And just I want to be completely clear, my line of questioning is basically, I have an extremely strong preference for local vendors. Okay, of course I want to follow whatever statute says, but my preference is that if a local person comes in and they're asking for work, that we find a way to help them get established as a vendor. What's our total budget?
Over $1 billion.
So 1.3 something billion with a B. It'd be great if $1.3 billion could stay here, and not just in the form of paychecks, but in the form of our expenditures.
Would love it. Definitely would love it. I'm an Osceola County resident for a very long time, and I certainly would like to keep the money here. Unfortunately, by statute, I can't.
I know.
do that. But purchasing is very willing, and we go up above and beyond, out of our way. When somebody calls, we take all the time we need to make sure they understand vendor link, how to get in there. We make sure they understand, we kind of find out from them, what is it that you offer? And then we can say, oh, okay, well, you know what, we really don't have a bid for that. That's really more through facilities, through the CMs. But here's how you can get a list of all the companies that are on our continuing service, and that would be subcon. So we really do take a lot of time to make sure these vendors know that. For the smaller projects that stay under $200,000, I know we don't really have that in here, but just so you know, we do have what we call our trade bids, where we put them out every year, but they are good for a 2-year term. But this way, every year, if there's a new group of vendors that fall under that trade, you know, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, all those trades, signs is one of them that we added just last year. So we do that every year, and that gives companies the ability to all get in this group, and then they all have an opportunity to be involved in the quote process for every project that goes out that's less than $200,000.
And several years ago, I can attest, I have actually been to that reverse trade show one time, and as a vendor to the school district. So I know that you guys are doing a great job, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that you're supported, you know, at least by me. I'm a very strong supporter of your efforts to bring in local people.
We try hard.
And I think that's why tab 3B exists too, because we understand that not everyone has the capacity to do a $50 million school locally. Even if they want to, they're going to have the insurance or bonding capacity to do that. So we do say, hey, please submit to us an effort that they're going to use local subcontractors on that. So I can see that being addressed.
For sure.
The other item is on tab 4, the Certified Minority Business Enterprise. What is the percentage of the total of 10 points is certified minority-owned businesses? And I know sometimes people do that at the federal level because they have to try to get federal contracts. Do we have some kind of reciprocity? Because a minority is a minority. They're not going to change their stripes for the state versus the federal government. Will we be willing to accept like the federal government certification of minority-owned?
It's a scored criteria, so it all depends on the selection committee members, whether they give them a 0 through a 5, depending on what criteria they turn in that's showing what level of that they have. We don't give a percentage. We don't have any statutory requirement or anything that tells us that we have to give a preference to that. So we're not allowed to do that right now, but because this is an RFQ, it can be looked at and scored through that process.
We're just trying to be more specific, like what Dr. Pace mentioned before. We're creating a defined rubric, you know, so
And
if
that's
somebody is
what-
a minority-owned business, what is the standard for that? Because there's no rubric, either you are or you're not, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
if
but-
you are, what is the amount in there, so that way everyone knows what the level playing field is, you know what I mean?
Well, when they review and decide the score from 0 to 5, they get a copy of this. They get a copy of what was actually in the RFQ that told them what they're looking for in that tab section. So that's the committee that should sit down and say, okay, the time, length, and business, and they need to make sure that they're scoring on all these things included in that tab.
And then the second part of that, which I mentioned before, are we accepting restricted process? You know, like from the federal government, because here we said state certified, but what if there's certified minority-owned business in the federal government? Rather than making them go through a second certification process, will we acknowledge that for this foreign purpose?
Osceola County Board of County Commissioners does that step for us. If they have a certification anywhere else, they just get it through them, and we piggyback on whatever Osceola County says. Osceola County makes sure that they get in there. It's actually all done through VendorLink even, where they could turn in their certification, Osceola County approves it, and then we view them as being minority. So there is a program for that. And we just piggyback on Osceola County Board of County Commissioners program. Okay, so the 0 through 5 is a proposed thing that we're looking to change in our documents, and that scoring criteria with the definitions of what 0 through 5 makes. Inside this handout that I gave you, there is a few tabs that are pointed out on the slideshow on page 10. The different tabs where we made a few changes as far as maybe the title to make it clearer what we're looking for. And then in the workload area, we added another little blurb about providing a separate, the projects that they're currently working on. This way we have a clear idea whether or not there's a conflict with maybe they're already too busy or not. So that's on there as well. That's a change that we put in this handout. And I kind of already talked about the 3A and the 3B, so it's slide 11, we've already kind of talked about. And we only use that in the Ccna process. We do, once I'm given the head nod or whatever I need to make all these changes in my RFQ document, I will take everybody that's ever been or gonna be on a selection committee and retrain them, because every committee member has been trained. They've had to go through my training so that they understand what we expect out of being on a committee and stuff. So I will retrain everybody all over again for that process once we do that. And I kind of already hit on the local vendor program because we kind of skipped out a line, but we're here at the end. So that's really all I have, unless anybody has any questions or do you have anything? I know that was quick and it was in a nutshell. I didn't want to take up too much of your time, but I want you guys to understand some of the processes that we have. And if there's ever a time that you don't understand a process or want more information, my door is open. Just give me a holler, drop by, come in, and I'll be happy to explain whatever you need explained.
Do we commit to like once a year having a how to do business with the school district open to the public type deal where vendors can come in there and figure out how to do it? You know, with you guys introducing the vendor link, kind of let them know what the score sheet is and that way they know what it is and know what the expectations are. You know, I've seen it done before in the past, but is it like a regular occurring event or once a year?
You know what the event is with the
That
county
is
and
the
the
event
cities
that
and
we went ahead and
codes?
combined forces, and that is the event. But we have never turned down a vendor to come in and sit down. I've had them sitting at my desk and getting them on VendorLink, show them all the advantages of VendorLink, show them how that works to their advantages for future bids. We never turn a vendor away. We will definitely always have the conversation with them in person, over the phone, whatever they want. We walk them through the process all the time. I've had many a call on a daily basis and they don't understand something, and I said, you know what, are you in front of a computer? Turn it on, I'll wait for you to get there, and I go through the whole process with them. So we don't want to leave any vendor behind.
We have a gentleman here that's, I don't know, that will probably want to meet you after the meeting, so in case we forget, we want you from the Chamber of Commerce, you know, they're waiting you. So.
They came looking for you.
Oh, no.
You know, but there could be maybe a workshop combined, you know what I'm saying? Have a combined workshop, and then she could moderate it and explain to your group of people how to get on the system.
I'm not shy. I'm happy to do that.
I know. We appreciate you.
I'm not shy.
I love that. So the question is, Mr. Chairman, and there, you guys are looking for approval of some sort for this?
We would like that. We would like to make sure that this might satisfy some of the concerns before.
Yeah.
It's not an action item, but
not an
we're
action
just
item
looking
at
for
the work.
consensus.
So I'm wondering,
Well, I've got some other questions on this that I don't really want to go through them in the essence of time right now, but I'd like us, if we're going to look at this as an action item, to do it either at the later board meeting or the next board meeting.
Absolutely, we can bring this back as an action
No,
item.
it's a workshop, so we have to publicly notice it.
Mr. Chairman, my recommendation would be you put it on a future meeting, schedule it, and that each board member, if you have thoughts or comments, see what staff can resolve ahead of time.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
That would be great.
Then, because we got the paper one, can we get an email, the document for the proposed changes?
Happy to. I emailed it to you, right, Tanya? Yeah, and I emailed it, so yeah, we've got it.
It's also been added to the board agenda, under the workshop, so it's there for you, but if you want it emailed to you,
Okay.
we can do that, and then it obviously will be published as an agenda item when we bring it back.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to point out an item of clarification. At current, we've been directed not to proceed with any RFQs until this issue is resolved. We do have several that are pending. One is for Gateway for the commissioning services, a critical project that we need to move forward with. The other RFQ is the design RFQ for the Oxa Tupperware Road. So we are waiting for this process to be cleared before we can proceed with those RFQs.
Next meeting is in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, on the 16th.
What will that do to you?
Yeah, would that delay your schedule?
That would be great.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you for pointing that out more. Thank you. Anything else? Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Appreciate you doing that.
Thank you, Ed, and to your.
Board, before we adjourn, I'm talking like Julius. Before we adjourn, any other comments or questions? If not, real quick, we're gonna have a 10-second training. In front of you, now you'll see a little light switch, Julius. You see the little light switch there somewhere?
Yeah.
Has your name on it? In order to help me, we used to have this till a couple months ago, and it switched out with some technology, but we got it back. When you wish to speak on an item, if you will touch your little light switch, I can tell, so I don't have to spin the whole time. And right in front of us, people who, when people are wanting to talk, so I don't miss people who are trying to get by. Particularly with a mask, it's a little harder for me to see your facial expressions. So if y'all would, as we go forward, let's try it, see if it'll work. And if nothing else, we will adjourn the workshop and reconvene our regularly scheduled meeting at 5:30. Thank you all.
Mark Panera's meals inside the board.